Captured German armored vehicles, armored personnel carriers, self-propelled guns, and tanks were used relatively often in the Red Army. The largest number of them were used in RKKA armored units in 1942-1943. Depending on the number of combat vehicles in the tactical formation, captured armored vehicles, the so-called Trofejednije, they were part of the equipment of special companies or battalions of captured vehicles, but often they were simply part of regular armored units, battalions, or brigades. In 1944-1945, Soviet armored units also used small numbers of the newest German medium tanks, the Panzer V Panther. During the Great Patriotic War, it happened that some tank brigades of the Red Army had at their disposal armored equipment of Soviet, Western, and German production. For example, in the records of armored equipment of the 52nd Armored Brigade from May 1942, it was noted that the unit had at that time 5 kW, 2 T-34, 13 T-60, 3 M3 Stuart, 1 EMA-3, Valentine, and 1 Panzer. 4. At the same time, the 5th Guards Tank Brigade had 3 Stug 3 assault guns, and the 121 Tank Brigade had 2 Panzer III medium tanks. With the subsequent defeats of German troops in the East and the resulting greater achievements of German armor technology, the number of captured machines used in the Red Army increased, both Panzerwaffe tanks and their allies. The scale of this phenomenon was so noticeable that appropriate regulations and instructions immediately appeared, which allowed for the optimal exploitation and use of tanks and assault guns in combat. In 1944-1945, small numbers of the newest tanks and self-propelled guns, Panzer V Panther, Panzer VI Tiger, or Nis, Nashorn, and others, appeared in Soviet tank brigades and corps. However, compared to the years 1942-1943, their number was negligible, which had its justification. Firstly, the amount of good quality armored equipment in the armored units of the Red Army increased significantly compared to previous years. Secondly, German tanks, as new technical generation equipment, were quite complex in design, which translated into problems with their daily operation and possible repairs and overhauls. The Panthers required a well-trained crew and high-class technical specialists, and this was generally a problem. Moreover, the use of the latest types of tanks and armored guns generated problems with ammunition and spare parts. There were also problems, as seemingly prosaic as it seemed, such as fuel of inadequate quality. Despite these problems, there are known and documented examples of the use of the above-mentioned armored vehicles by Red Army units, including at least several Panthers. We are talking about the exploitation and combat use of the 5 mentioned in the sources, but it can be assumed that the incidental use of the Panther on the front line was more common. Simply abandoned or slightly damaged, Soviet crews could man the Panthers and use them for a short period of time, in one combat or for several consecutive days, until they ran out of ammunition, suffered damage, or some other situation forced the tank to be abandoned. Since the tank was not entered into the register, and no attempt was made to renovate it, due to the lack of personnel, spare parts, ammunition, its use was not recorded in official documents. Of course, it is difficult to talk about any mass use of Panthers or Tigers. One should always keep in mind the appropriate scale of the described phenomenon. Nevertheless, even a few days of combat use of the excellent Panthers, appreciated especially for the ballistic performance of the 75mm guns mounted in them, could bring specific tactical benefits in tank battles, when Soviet tanks encountered significant numbers of not only Panzer IV, but Panzer V, and even the Panzer VI. An example would be the July and August battles in eastern Poland and on the outskirts of Warsaw in 1944, where the attacking Soviet armies had to fight with selected armored units of the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS, abundantly equipped with Panther battalions. The first reports about the use of captured Panthers by a unit of the Red Army date back to their combat debut in mid-1943. As is known, 200 Panthers from the 10th Tank Brigade underwent their baptism by fire during the offensive on the Kursk in July 1943, and it was not a successful debut. Damaged and crashed combat vehicles became the object of interest of the opposing side as new equipment with unknown characteristics, although the Panther did not arouse as much concern among the Russians as the Tiger did in 1942. Messages from the front near Kursk talked about the appearance of a new type of tank, but there was no enthusiasm about the new Panzerwaffe vehicle. One of the reports wrote about the new tank. At 11:00, 2 German Type 5 tanks, strongly resembling our medium tank but with a longer gun, came to defensive positions. It was reported that the Panthers were destroyed at short range. New German tanks stopped. One of them caught fire. The crew did not manage to leave the tank. After the fight, 2 to 5 holes left by 76mm bullets were found on the sides of the hit Type 5 tanks. As emphasized in the literature on the subject, attention is drawn to the almost routine content of this message. According to reports from the front, 43 Panther tanks were destroyed, which led the Soviet command to the conclusion that it was not a superweapon. However, obviously, research on wrecks and damaged tanks of this type began immediately.